Alright, listen up. What I have today for you is some highbrow 147 IQ analysis of the world first race. Yeah. You might be like, dude, I don't give a shit about the world first race. This doesn't really concern me. Nothing they do matters to me, pretty much. Which is true. However, you might have realized that many times what is going to happen amongst the best guilds is what people are going to see, is what people are going to observe, and then whatever happens there many times can have a ripple effect on the rest of the player base. Just like, you watch your favorite streamer or YouTuber in any type of game and they do something and then the rest of the community follows suit. For example, when it comes to this game, it's about playing a certain spec. You don't care if the top guilds racing for high rankings, top 10 in the world and such, can play a certain spec. But, for example, a few weeks from now, that particular decision from the top guilds will have snowballed into the player base, and now suddenly you have survival hunters everywhere. You didn't particularly care if top guilds decided to play survival, but a few weeks later, many people would have tried to copy them and started playing survival. This is of course a purely hypothetical scenario. Survival is dead, but the example still stands. The reason why we are looking into this is because there's going to be some very clear differences between what the player base is playing right now in Heroic as well as the first few days of Mythic compared to what the top guilds are doing. So what I mean is, some specs might be super popular right now, played by many people. It might be Marksmanship, it might be Unholy, DK, Fury, Elemental, or specs that have grown at the start of this tier that previously weren't that popular, like Frost Mage, like Arcane Mage, like Assassination Rogue. And the question is, are they actually being used by top guilds, or is it just something that the community is doing, but for the purpose of early kills in Mythic progression, they are not really, considered. Same can be said for tanks, and same can be said for healers. We said that Vengeance Demon Hunter was losing a little bit of popularity when it came to the entirety of the player base. Is it still true for top guilds, for example? Same for healers. We said, generally speaking, the whole player base is still playing with Holy Paladin, Restoration Shaman, and Discipline Priest. Is it changing when it comes to top guilds? So looking at the highest bosses being killed right now, which are the Remnant of Ner'Zhul, the Soulrender Dormazain, Painsmith Raznal, and Guardian of the First One. So we're talking about 20 to 15 guilds having gotten this far. It's very good to start with this because, for example, these are the tanks currently being used in Mythic. So you wonder which tanks are popular, you wonder which tanks are doing well. You go and look at this and you're like, okay, it's Brewmaster Monk. The big surprise is that Blood DK is getting much more representation when it comes to raids. Not as much when it comes to Mythic Plus. We will go and look at that in a later video, but Brewmaster is still there, and then Vengeance is losing a bit of representation, but it is still quite popular. When we go, instead, and look at all of the guilds that so far have killed Remnant of Ner'Zhul, the most represented tank and the most utilized tank is Protection Paladin out of all of them. So the currently least used tank by the rest of the player base doing Mythic is the most used tank in high ranking progression. Not to mention the third at this moment most popular tank and the previously most popular tank in the last season, Vengeance. There was only one of them together with Guardian Druid. So this already gives you a pretty stark difference compared to what the rest of the player base is doing when you look at the very high ranking kills. Now, if instead we look at the healers, we start having a little bit more of a familiar look, because just like it is happening in the general population where Holy Paladin, Restoration Shaman, and Discipline Priest are the two go specs, when you look at the raids, it looks to be about the same. Holy, Restoration, and Discipline, except for the odd random Mistweaver in there, it's basically just those three specs. If we wanted to look at the minor difference, Holy Paladin is above Restoration Shaman. Generally speaking, it was the opposite. It was Restoration being the more popular, followed by Holy, whereas here, it's Holy that has the advantage. Maybe this will continue in the later bosses. Now, what about DPS? Because right now, the most popular DPS are Balance, Destruction, Marksmanship, Frost Mage, Shadow Priest, Havoc, Unholy, Fury, Elemental. What do we see in the top guilds? Do we have the same type of results? Well, for the most part we do, because Balanced Druid and Destruction Warlock are by far the most popular, which actually fits pretty well with the rest of the player base. Those are also the two most popular specs. Havoc is also the first most popular melee DPS spec, which is also consistent with the rest of the player base. We start having the first differences, for example, when it comes to arms. As of right now, arms is in the bottom half for population, we can say. Not just in Heroic, where we have dozens of thousands of parses, but even in Mythic, where the logs are only, 200, 250, 300, so it's less reliable, but even then, arms is less popular than Fury Warrior. Yet, pretty much everyone on the whole, across the board, killing Remnant of Ner'Zhul, so a pretty high-ranked guild, is just going for arms. We have, of course, the question mark. The guilds killing Remnant of Ner'Zhul killed it pretty much, many of them before their warrior had the chance to snatch the Sinful Surge legendary. Now they do have. Now most of them should have it already, so maybe something will change later on. But for now, Arms Warrior, unlike what the popularity of the specs suggests, is heavily more favored over Fury. The rest of the specs remain consistent. Shadow Priest, Assassination, and Frost Mage are amongst the more populated. At which point, the question is, okay, who is missing from this? Yes, you don't need to tell me that Affliction Warlock or Fire Mage or Feral Druid are not being played here. I already knew this. Which of the specs that could have been played based on their popularity, based on, how many players are playing them, which of them are missing so far from this boss kill? The notable ones missing are Subtlety, which is of course partially excused by the fact that Assassination is being played, therefore it's very likely that Subtlety will not be played. Aside from Subtlety, you have Unholy, with just 2 Unholy DPS in 16 boss kills, as well as just 2 Marksmanship Hunters, as well as 1 Elemental, 1 Retribution Paladin, and no Demonology. So in roughly about 220 DPS players for 16 boss kills, this is the tiny representation of these specs, which were supposedly powerful and supposedly performing well when we go and look at the logs, when we go and look at the representation from the first week of Heroic and the first few logs of Mythic. These guys are the notable ones missing compared to what was expected of them. Now, moving over to the next boss, Soulrender Dormazain. About 15 guilds we have logs for. We have the data for the top 15 guilds having killed Dormazain. I think the total is like 19 or so guilds, but the remaining 4 haven't made their logs public, so we don't know what they did with it. But of the ones that exist, we have another change. We go from Protection Paladin being slightly more popular than the rest of the tanks to a complete domination of Blood DKs. So pretty much just Blood DKs for this boss. Now, it's not that I want to give Blood DKs false hope. The reason why there is this overwhelming presence of Blood DKs in this fight is that, yeah, technically they are kind of bad on Dormazain because you have to do the dance and you're slow as fuck as a DK, so it's not gonna be that easy. But the reason why there is so many of them is because of the most sworn agonizers. They are infuriatingly slow and infuriatingly ignoring you whenever you try to group them up, and they have a pretty annoying and pretty dangerous cast called Agonizing Nova. So what do you do with them? You use Mass Grip. You grip them all together because it's the easiest and fastest way. Otherwise you have to tinker with things like Thunderstorm and Typhoon and trying to just group them in by going around them and knocking them towards the group. Instead, with a DK you just Mass Grip them every time, like that, extremely quickly. So Blood DK makes this fight much more trivial when it comes to ad management. That is primarily why all of a sudden, out of nowhere, so many Blood DKs are being used. And we will see it's going to be primarily just for this fight. They will not maintain this heavy presence in the other bosses. When we look at healers, we continue with the same standard. Even on Soulrender Dormazain, which is actually a 5 heal fight. So not 4 healers. Here you have even an extra slot, so you might be thinking, okay, We can slot in a Holy Priest for HPS and throughput, maybe a Restoration Druid for the same reason. We are not that limited in healer numbers, so we don't have to fight for a spot for raid cooldowns with 5 healers. We should have more than enough. Even then, the result is the same. Holy Paladin is at the top, followed by Restoration Shaman, and then followed by Discipline, with again the odd Mistweaver in there. Still no Holy Priest, still no Restoration Druid. This is still consistent with the representation in Mythic and Heroic, the only difference being that Holy Priest is generally popular, as popular or similarly popular to Discipline, but as I mentioned before, generally speaking, Holy Priest is gonna get way more logs, way more representation when it comes to Heroic, and lower entry barrier Mythic bosses, because throughput is still good there. You don't get the, highly tuned later heroic bosses or mythic bosses with a lot of damage, a lot of burst, which requires strong cooldowns. So Holy Priest can still make it, but the moment you start needing the big stuff, the moment you start needing the barriers and the spirit shells, that's when Holy Priest starts losing a lot of representation. Now, what about the DPS for Soulrender Dormazain? Because Ner'Zhul was mostly single target with some decent cleave, which is why Destruction, for example, was popular, because, their Havoc works really well. With the orbs you can take down on Ner'Zhul, but Soulrender has a bunch of adds you want to take down, so not just 2-target cleave, but more heavy and substantial AoE. Do we have any differences when it comes to DPS? Well, immediately we can see that yes, there is a change, because Balanced Druid is still there, but what's missing is Destruction. Destruction falls off the face of the earth, is completely removed, and it's replaced by Demonology. Now, Destruction has the Havoc, has the 2-target cleave that you can have on Remnant of Ner'Zhul. Those orbs make for some very well Havoc target for Destruction. Arms, again, is still there instead of Fury. Havoc is still very present. We have already pointed out Vengeance isn't there, so you know that when Vengeance isn't popular, in the worst case scenario, you will still want a Havoc in your raid, even just one, because of the debuff, right? So with 15 or so kills of this boss, you basically had 15 guaranteed Havoc players being in your raid, and now we have 18. Frost Mage is still the majority of the mage specs in these top kills. The other surprise, the other addition is that Marksmanship comes alive again. Previously, it was basically completely ignored on Ner'Zhul, and now it becomes much more relevant, as well as Unholy, which was mostly missing from Ner'Zhul. What about the actually missing specs, of the specs that have performed well, or of the specs that are popular with the rest of the raiding population who is missing from here? The notable ones missing are Shadow. 7 Shadow Priest is still a decent number, but it's basically cut by 60%, 66% compared to the previous boss, as well as Elemental and Subtlety are still missing. Now, we move over to Painsmith Raznal. So, the minigame boss, the boss with the intermission, the boss with the whole dodging and skipping and jumping of the balls, and then the spikes, and then dealing with the chains, knocking people away, and all that sort of stuff. What about tanks? So the Soulrender gimmick of Blood Decay goes away, and we go back to the more standard situation we have seen with Ner'Zhul, which is Protection Paladins again being the most represented tank. And the similar situation we have now seen for 3 bosses in a row, which is that Guardian Druid and Vengeance Demon Hunter are the least represented tanks. When it comes to healers, now we have an even more extreme version of what we have had for the previous bosses, which is just Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest, and Restoration Shaman. This time we don't even have the odd Mistweaver in there. The only clear thing, though, in the first 3 bosses is that over time, slowly, Restoration Shaman has kept dropping in representation. Holy Paladin has kept gaining more and more, Discipline has gained slightly more, and the one that had been dropping in representation has been Restoration Shaman, which is of course notable because it is the complete opposite as what's been happening with the rest of the player base. In both Heroic and now Mythic, Restoration is still the more popular one, not in these boss kills. Now, when it comes to DPS, Painsmith Raznal loses the adds, loses any sort of consistent AoE. It does have a couple of adds spawning in the intermission, so Destruction becomes viable again over Demonology. Balanced Druid is still there, still not moving from the top. Havoc Demon Hunters, as mentioned already, continue being represented. with the lack of Vengeance Demon Hunters. Arms is still the represented warrior specs. And then we still have Frost Mage. We do have more Retribution Paladins now, as well as the change from Assassination to Subtlety for Painsmith Raznal. This makes so that of the notable missing specs, we have Marksmanship, which goes back to just being 1. They had some representation back given to them on Soulrender Dormazain with 11, but they go back here on Raznal being basically just 1. Same Elemental. Elemental continues despite their rise in popularity and performance from the end of Castornatria to the start of this tier. When it comes to high-end progression, they are not really being considered. Same goes with the obvious of Demonology and Assassination going back to 0 because everyone for this boss fight is playing Destruction and Subtlety, together with Unholy. Unholy also had some representation back on Soulrender, and on this boss fight Raznal they go back to not really being used. Now the last one we have for today is Guardian of the First Ones. There is just 5 guilds available with their data for us, and we have again Protection, Paladin and Brewmaster Monk being the more represented tanks. And again, of course, Vengeance and Guardian Druid aren't really there. When it comes to the healers, it's again the same extremization of what we've had before. So basically half the entire healer roster is going to be Holy Paladins, and then the rest is going to be split between Discipline and Restoration Shaman. Guardian of the First One is a pretty tight single target, pure single target fight, so it makes sense that single target heavy specs like Demonology take back the reins over something like Destruction. Subtleties in there. Arms, of course, remains very popular, together with Havoc, Balance, and Shadow Priest. It's worth mentioning that when you look at these numbers, because we have such few guilds, because Protection Warriors are not very popular, having Arms Warrior is also pretty much mandatory, at least 1 per raid, because of Battle Shout. The same argument for Havoc and their debuff, their magical damage debuff. When it comes to Fatescribe, no real point to even go for a list because there is just 4 logs available for now, and this is what we have. We have Blood Decay being used again, as opposed to what we've had for all of the other bosses, except for Soulrender, where Blood Decay was also the most popular. And when it comes to healers, we have the final extremization of what we started with. We started with what it looked like was going to be similar to the last tier, with Shaman very close to Holy Paladin and then Discipline below. And then as we went through the bosses, Holy kept slightly rising, so did Discipline, and Restoration Shaman started dropping, up until the point where there isn't even a single Restoration Shaman in here, and it's just being split between Holy and Discipline. With the DPS remaining consistent in its choices, it's Destruction Warlock, which alternates with Demonology depending on the damage profile of the boss, favoring either Demonology or Destruction. Arms remains the warrior spec, Balanced Druid remains the overall more popular one, and as you can see, you get your guaranteed spot of your Havoc for every single boss. And this is what it's been looking so far with the top guilds, which I find interesting. It is interesting because, as I mentioned, it's not completely respecting and reflecting what the rest of the player base is doing. If we just go by the parses, so if we just go by how many classes and specs have logged in Mythic so far, there is of course a clear difference when it comes to Fury Warriors not really being played as opposed to the Arms Warriors, as well as Marksmanship not really being played. You also have Elemental and Arcane being pretty high in popularity, which are not really being played. You have Windwalker, which is technically more popular than Arms, Ret, Subtlety. It's not really happening in here. The same can be said for tanks and healers. You know, people are still moving off of the inertia that they had in 9.0.5 and Castornatria. For example, Vengeance in Heroic is still by far the most popular tank, as you can see here. But now, if we go by this logically, this is bound to somewhat go upside down. Eventually, more and more Havoc Demon Hunters will become played, Vengeance will become less and less popular. More and more tanks will go back to Brewmaster or Blood Decay or even Prot Paladin, and Vengeance will slowly lose its popularity if it keeps going like it has been so far. The only interesting one is going to be healers in terms of representation and popularity, because Restoration Shaman has not been dropped as hard as Vengeance has, so it's not that it's gonna disappear. It's still being used, and even when you go lower in ranks, but still very good guilds, so guilds ranked 30 or 40 or 50 in the world is still played, and still the second or third more popular one. But it is interesting to see that Holy Paladin has overtaken Restoration so decisively. It wasn't like this in previous tiers, pretty much. We will finish this video with the consideration related to Mythic Plus, since we will have a similar video related to how the representation of Mythic Plus has been going, and if it has, you know, mirrored what Mythic raiding has been doing. And it's gonna be interesting if some of these specs are basically doubling down in the representation, or maybe doubling down in losing the representation in Mythic Plus as well. You know, for example, up until this point, we knew that Restoration Shaman was much more popular than Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus, but in the high keys, in the highest of keys, it was Holy Paladin that was dominant. And now, in Mythic raiding is happening the same thing. Restoration Shaman is the more popular class compared to Holy Paladin, but at the very high end of progression, it's Holy Paladin that is being played. So this would be, you know, a two-pronged attack of Holy Paladin over Restoration Shaman. Not just Mythic Plus, which we knew already, but raid encounters as well. Same can be said for tanks. If Vengeance Demon Hunter will be as less played in Mythic Plus as it has been so far in raid encounters, and then the same can be said for DPS specs. So that video will come out probably not tomorrow, probably Monday or Tuesday at the end of the second week of Mythic Plus. We will take a look at that. For now, we can stop here. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to support the channel, myself, my cat, or my neighbors, you should probably just do nothing, actually. Yeah, I just hyped myself up for no punchline. Sorry. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, what you're listening here is a Pringles paprika flavored